Hi everyone. As I promised, I'm going to answer the questions that you wrote on the post-its on the station that required you to ask questions or if you had doubts. So the first one is, what does non-station work really mean? And so basically, so we saw station work, right? We have an in-class flip using stations, and one of the stations has flipped content, right? It has to have the instruction that is replacing you as a teacher giving this instruction. So when we do non-station work, you're giving students the different material, but you're not working in stations. So an example of non-station work is when you give students a video, you ask them to access the video on their cell phones by themselves, for example, using headphones, and they have to, I don't know, complete a worksheet, answer a question, have a discussion based on that video, but that video is giving them the explanation instead of you being the one who gives them the explanation. That's an example of solo. Here's another question which connects, and it says, can you give me an example of non-station work? I'm sorry. Yes, can you give me an example of non-station work? So solo is if they do that individually, duo if they do it in pairs, and group if they work in groups. I hope that clarifies. Another question is, what are the characteristics of the dual flip, and what is it important to keep in mind? So the characteristics of duo is in pairs, right? And what do you need to keep in mind? Well, that when you're asking students to access flipped content in pairs, make sure you have the resources, make sure that the instructions are clear, make sure that the way you have paired students will allow them to work in the best way possible, if they get along, if they have a similar level. If you decide to pair them with different levels, then make sure that the one who has the highest level will pull them instead of, just doing all the work, right? So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, another question here is how to design an in-class flip in sequential order if students are required to start at station 1. So if you have how to design it depends on the number of students that you have, right? If it's a sequence, you need to make sure that all your students will start at station 1, so you can duplicate the station. If I have 12 students, then I can make 3 station 1s, right? And put them in groups of 4, and then I can make 3 station 2s and 3 station 3s. It really depends on how much space you have and the possibilities of duplicating the stations. But also, something you can do is put students in stations and not necessarily rotate the students, but you rotate the material. So you say, okay, we're going to do what you should be doing in station 1. So here is the material for station 1. And then, basically what you do is that you rotate the material. And it's a way of working with stations, but not necessarily moving around. So that's another idea. Here's another question, which is it good to have an order to go over the stations, or is it better not having an order? This depends on what you're planning. So if I need everybody to access the flipped content in order to continue in the other stations, then you're going to tell them, look, you need to go first to this one. But if you're planning a mixed in-class flip, then the order will vary according to students' knowledge, and some of them will make a choice not to go to that station. Remember, we discussed that you can create, for example, 7 stations and tell students, look, you just need to go to 3. And definitely you need to go to this station. So then students will rotate around the 7 stations, and as they do the work, they'll make sure they go to that station you asked them to go to. Okay, another question is, can we use in-class flip with public schools? Jornada única. You can use in-class flip with anyone. The people that I have had the opportunity to talk to around the world are using in-class flip with public schools, private schools, institutes, universities, teacher training. So in reality, whether it's public or private, shouldn't have an effect on if you want to use it or not. What it will affect affect is the type of tools that you use. So remember, it could be tech or non-tech, right? You can do an in-class flip with posters, mini posters, with flashcards, with the reading, right? Or maybe with just your tech tools. Here's another question that connects, and it is in-class flip suitable for all levels and large groups? I think it's suitable for all levels, and we discussed that in order to give the instructions, it's important to take into account the level, right? So you're going to give very simple instructions or vary them with pictures or drawings, right? Or audio, or you giving the instruction, using gestures. So I think it's suitable for all ages, regardless of how much English they know. And it works with large groups. In my case, I did an in-class flip with 53 teachers, and that's a large group. And I think it was 8 stations or 7 stations, and they rotated, and it worked. It worked fine. So I don't think that's a problem. I talked to a teacher in the US who does in-class flips with 100 students in a huge classroom. So I think it's completely doable. Okay. Another question connected to this is in-class flip suitable for kids? If so, what ages and how? So I know teachers who have done in-class flip with students at transition level and kindergarten. So because of their experience, I could tell you yes. Those, like young ages, you can do in-class flips, but keep in mind the type of tasks that you plan, because if the station is required for the student to be completely autonomous, well, we know that young learners are learning to be autonomous. So probably the station would have to be something that they could do without the teacher or with you monitoring in that particular station if they're very, very young. So just keep that in mind, okay? Another question is, how can we make sure students don't move to Spanish when we're teaching in Jornada Única? There are a lot of strategies. I think particularly if you give them prompts to follow, if you give them a specific task, if you assign like English monitors, it really depends on how you reflect on the importance of using English. Some teachers, they give points, or they take off points, or they give a grade, and they ask students to self-reflect. But I think this is something that we all suffer in general. Like in my classes, I have students who I have to go back and say, excuse me, what? How do you say that in English? And they are in high levels. So that's the answer that I can come up with. But I still struggle with this situation. So probably we can find more solutions and share them, or more strategies to see how we can overcome this issue, which I also suffer. Okay, another question is, how often should you apply this approach during a course? This approach, if we're talking about in-class flip, my recommendation is, plan it as often as you can and as you see suitable to the content that you want to teach. In my particular case, I flip everything. So my course, I combine flipped, I sent some things home, in-class flip with solo duos or groups, and station work. What I don't do is station work every day. That's crazy, right? So students will get bored, if they get the same thing all the time. So keep that in mind when you're planning station work. And that connects to the next question, which was, how much longer do you think flip approach can be implemented before students get bored? Students get bored when you're predictable. So if you're flipping, or you're in-class flipping, and your activities are varied, are active, are dynamic, are meaningful, are connected to the students and to their personal lives, then I don't see why they should get bored of the fact that you're flipping. They get bored of the type of activities that you do. And of course, doing station work, if it's always station work, well, they get bored because, they want to do other types of things. They want to maybe watch a video in pairs, maybe in group, maybe do a whole group discussion, maybe have a debate, etc. So that's something that we should keep in mind in our planning in general. Another question is differentiation possible if you only have a group of students for a month? Yes. It's as possible as with as much as we can do in that month, right? So you can take into account the different levels, you can take into account the different learning preferences, and differentiate through providing videos, audios, readings, right? That's a way of differentiating. Taking into account specific needs of some students and adapting to that student, even if you're only with them for a month, and making choices on how you're going to assign homework or tasks based on the group, planning, also taking into account their interests. So if students love karaoke, why not plan a lesson with karaoke, right? That's differentiation. So yes, I think it's possible. And of course, if the more time we get with our students, the more we know them, the closer we are to them, and that I guess the more effective our decisions could be to differentiate. But I don't think the fact that we only see them for a month should be a limit, at least to try to differentiate as much as we can. All right. Another question is, how can formative assessments be implemented using in-class flip? So, in-class flip is, if you in-class flip in one lesson, then you decide how you're going to assess the process of that lesson, right? If you want to make a rubric based on what they do in the different stations, that would be a way of assessing the process. If at the end of the station, of all the station works, they have to, for example, make a video speaking, then you would take into account the process. You can look at everything you collected through the lessons, or simply you could take note of what you're seeing in that lesson, right? You're walking around, you're monitoring, you're not the center of the class, so you're noticing things, and then you're taking notes, and based on that, you're giving students feedback of how they're doing the work and not giving them a grade. So that's, those are ways that you could do formative assessments. This connects to another question, which is, how can we provide feedback in each station according to the activities they've worked on? So you can provide feedback depending on the tools that you use. If you give them answer keys, that's a way of giving them, that's a way they have immediate feedback of what they're doing, right? They have a board game and the board game has the answers there. There's feedback there. If you ask them to use digital tools that give them automatic feedback, that's also a way. You can create activities where the answer, they can discuss or the answers of something, and then you can make a video discussing the responses. So that's a way that you can provide feedback. But the most important thing is to monitor, to walk around, and as soon as you notice something going on that requires immediate feedback, give it to them. Okay? Some teachers write feedback in post-it notes, and then as they're walking, they're placing the post-it note next to the student so that they can receive it. Some take note and they give general feedback at the end of the lesson. So, it's not the way you give feedback is more particular to your pedagogical approach towards feedback than whether you're flipping or not. All right, and our last question, do we have to give feedback at the end of each station? So connected to the previous one, you don't have to give feedback at the end of each station if the station is not proposed with an activity that requires feedback, right? So for example, you make a silent reading station, and the intention is simply for the student to read. That doesn't require your feedback. But if you're doing activities that want to show application of the content that they've learned through the flipped station, for example, if we're talking about stations, which is what the question is focusing on, then yes, then you can give feedback. You don't have to give feedback at the end of the station that day. You can collect whatever you assigned and then give feedback.